You think the Nazca Lines are just beautiful figures for tourists to admire from an aeroplane. Just mysterious birds, spirals, and trapezoids carved into the sand. Then get ready, because one new version may overturn everything we have been told about this desert for decades. For almost 80 years, scientists, historians, and lovers of sensational theories have argued over one question. Who created these giant signs, and why? Some said they were ancient roads. Others saw a calendar. Some claimed they were plans for irrigation systems, and the boldest voices whispered about landing strips for those who came from beyond this earth. But what if all of that was only distracting noise? What if the real answer was not hidden in the sky, but right under human feet? What if these lines were not pictures, but sacred paths that people walked? What if the Nazca Desert was not a gallery of ancient art, but a gigantic ritual space where every step, every turn, and every offering carried a terrifying meaning? And the most disturbing part is this. Archaeologists found not only lines, they found traces of movement. Stone platforms, broken vessels, shells, remains of food. Objects that look far too much like ritual offerings. And one discovery may explain why ancient people turned the desert into a huge sacred map. Today we will examine a version that sounds far stronger than stories about aliens, because this version speaks of fear, drought, water, ceremonies, and an ancient people who may have tried to bargain with the gods themselves. Watch until the end, and you will learn why the Nazca Lines may not have been a message for the sky, but roads of desperate prayer left on the earth thousands of years ago. The mysterious Nazca Lines became known to the world not through an ancient chronicle, not through a secret archive, and not through the sensational confession of a priest. It happened in a much rougher and more modern way. In the late 1920s, aircraft began flying over Peru, and that was when the desert suddenly gave up what had been lying under everyone's feet for centuries. People flying from Lima to Arequipa looked down at the lifeless sands and suddenly saw not chaos, not random tracks, not the marks of an ordinary road, but giant figures, as if drawn by a hand that knew in advance. From the ground, almost no one would understand them. This is where the real blow to ordinary logic begins. If these signs were created by ancient people, why did their main effect reveal itself only from above? Why did the drawings hidden in the desert north of the city of Nazca seem to wait not for a farmer, not for a traveler, not for a resident of a nearby valley, but for a human being who would one day rise into the air? Was it an accident? Or did the ancient makers already understand space in a way their descendants would only grasp in the age of aviation? This refers to the late 1920s, when the development of air routes in Peru effectively turned an ordinary flight into one of the loudest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Pilots and passengers flying over the southern part of the country saw below them a dead, dry, deceptively empty land. But that emptiness turned out not to be empty at all. It was a vast page covered with lines, where a person on the ground could notice only stones, sand, and long furrows. The view from above revealed a system. Straight strips, stretched outlines, strange shapes, confident turns. The desert suddenly looked not like a natural landscape, but like a platform on which someone had left colossal signs. And the most irritating fact for official calm is this. These drawings were not hidden in a cave, not buried underground, and did not require complex excavations. They lay openly, under the sun, in deserted sands. For centuries the wind blew over them, Generations passed above them, but their real form was seen only when a person rose into the sky in a machine of the 20th century. North of the city of Nazca, the ancient desert preserved images that could not be properly judged by an ordinary view from the ground. A person could stand beside a line and see only part of it, the way a blind man sees the edge of a huge painting. He could walk along it, cross it, even live near it, and still fail to understand that before him was a fragment of the gigantic design. Only from above did these scattered strokes gather into a disturbing picture. And here comes the uncomfortable question. Who was it made for? For those who walked on the earth? For gods who did not need an aeroplane? For priests who knew the hidden order of the lines? Or for a future human being who, centuries later, would rise above Peru and suddenly realize that the ancient desert had never been silent? The discovery of the Nazca Lines in the late 1920s was not just an archaeological episode. It challenged the habit of calling ancient cultures primitive. Researchers were not facing crude scratches in the sand, but gigantic drawings arranged as if their makers worked with scale, space, and precision that did not fit the convenient image of a simple ancient people. That is why the first aerial observations over the Nazca region became an explosion for the imagination. Lima, Arequipa, southern Peru, deserted sands, all of this stopped being just geography. It turned into a map of a question that even now is dangerous to answer too confidently. How did people living in a world without modern aviation create images that truly began to speak only when aviation appeared? The impressive patterns and figures drawn directly on the ground received a dry scientific name: geoglyphs. But that word is far too calm for what actually lies in the Nazca Desert. We are not talking about a couple of strange stripes or random scratches on the surface. We are talking about a gigantic system of signs stretched across a vast territory. This is not a drawing on a cave wall, not an ornament on a vessel, and not a pattern carved into stone. This is a desert turned into a canvas. Ancient geoglyphs have been found in different parts of the world, so the concept itself is not new. But Nazca breaks out of the ordinary list sharply, boldly, almost offensively. The scale is so large that comfortable explanations begin to crack. About 4,000 square kilometers of desert are covered with thousands of lines, figures, and strange images. Some signs stretch for dozens of meters, others for hundreds. And all of this was created not in a city, not next to palaces or temples, but in a dry, deserted landscape where nature itself seems to have preserved the traces of an ancient design. This refers to the Nazca Plateau in Peru, where the geoglyphs are not a single isolated find, but a huge complex that can be fully understood only from above. The most provocative thing here is not the fact that ancient people made drawings. Ancient people drew everywhere and at all times. The provocation is different. Why were these images made in such a way that a person standing on the ground can barely see them in full? He stands next to a line, and in front of him there is only a strip, stones, soil, and dry surface. He takes a few steps and still sees only a fragment. But once the viewer rises into the air, the scattered lines suddenly form figures. Nazca contains geometry that looks almost too confident for a desert landscape. Triangles, trapezoids, spirals, and long straight lines. It also contains images of animals, plants, and human beings. Birds, stretched contours, strange silhouettes, figures that cannot be properly judged while standing beside them. This is not decoration for a random passerby. This is a system built for scale, distance, and height. And here comes the uncomfortable question. If an ancient maker could not rise into the sky in an airplane, why create an image that reveals itself from the air? Who was this giant graphic language intended for? For people walking through the desert? For priests who knew the hidden scheme? For gods who, according to ancient belief, could see the earth from above? Or for future generations who would one day gain the ability to look at this plateau from the sky? This refers to the sharpest feature of the Nazca Lines. Their full image almost does not belong to the person standing on the ground. It belongs to the view from above. Officially, everything can be explained calmly. Geoglyphs, ancient culture, desert climate, preserved lines, archaeological complex. But the more one looks at the numbers, the less it resembles simple folk art. Thousands of drawings, dozens and hundreds of meters in length, a huge territory, a variety of forms, and most importantly, dependence on an aerial perspective. There are too many coincidences here for an ordinary decoration of the desert. One simple detail is especially irritating. These lines are not hidden and not protected by walls. They lie on open ground, as if someone was certain that the desert itself would become their guardian. Wind, sun, dry climate, and the almost complete absence of rain did what no museum could do. They preserved giant signs through the centuries until the moment when human beings finally saw them the way they appear from above. That is why Nazca shocks not only with its size, it shocks with the boldness of the design. Ancient people did not merely leave marks on the ground. They created a space that humiliates the ordinary human viewpoint. Stand beside it and you understand almost nothing. Rise higher and the desert begins to speak. And that is no longer just archaeology. That is a challenge. How were these geoglyphs used? This is the question that breaks the comfortable picture of Nazca more sharply than any fantasy about alien landing strips. If the lines were simply drawings, the entire story runs into a dead end. Why create gigantic images that can barely be read from the ground? But if these lines were not pictures meant for viewing, but routes meant for movement, then the Nazca Desert stops being a mysterious gallery and becomes a vast ritual ground. The answer to this question was offered by geophysicists and participants in the Nazca-Palpa project. Their version is not as loud as stories about visitors from the stars, but it hits much harder. The people of the Nazca era may not have been interested in the figures as images. They may have been interested in the actions that took place on those lines. The main point was not the drawing, but the movement. Not the picture, but the procession. Not the view from above, but the path followed by the participants in the ceremony. This refers to the central turn in the entire subject. The Nazca Lines may have been not objects for passive observation, but part of a living ceremonial action. This is where the familiar mystery changes direction. For decades, people argued about who was supposed to look at these enormous signs. But perhaps ancient people did not set themselves that task at all. Perhaps they were not creating pictures in the modern sense. They were creating sacred trajectories that had to be walked. The ground became not a canvas, but a route. The desert was not a museum, but a place of ritual. This version is especially uncomfortable for those who want simple answers. It does not give a cheap explanation like, it was a calendar, it was an airfield, or it was a map. It points to a more complex system where a line could be a sign, a road, and a ritual element at the same time. Such an object cannot be understood by merely looking down at it from the sky. It must be imagined in action. People entering the line, moving along it, repeating a fixed path, perhaps carrying offerings, following order, and staying within the boundaries of a sacred route. And if this is true, then the meaning of the geoglyphs was not to amaze a viewer once. Their meaning may have been repeated again and again. Every ceremony brought the line back to life. Every passage turned dry earth into an active sanctuary. Every step confirmed a bond between human beings and a space that, for them, was not empty desert, but a place of appeal to higher powers. This refers to the version that the spectators of the Nazca period may have been interested precisely in the processions moving along the lines, not in the outlines of the figures as finished drawings. One important detail makes this hypothesis especially strong. Many figures of the Nazca culture were built from simple, non-intersecting lines. This means that a person could enter such a line at one point, follow it, and leave it at another without stepping over other marks. For an ordinary drawing, this is not necessary. For a route, it is almost perfect. Such a structure seems designed not only for the eye, but also for movement. And here comes a hard question. Why did ancient makers avoid chaotic intersections so carefully? Why are many lines arranged as if they were meant to guide a person? Why does a figure turn into a path, and a path into a ritual? This is no longer random geometry in the sand. This is discipline imposed on space. This is order drawn on the ground with such confidence that every turn, every straight line, and every exit may have had meaning. That is why the geophysical version looks dangerously convincing. It takes cheap sensation away from Nazca and gives it back real scale. We may be looking not merely at drawings that someone once saw from an aeroplane. We may be looking at roads of ritual, where the main spectacle was not the line itself, but the people walking along it. It was the procession that turned the geoglyph from a dead form into an event. This refers to the most important shift in the understanding of Nazca. The geoglyphs may have been not only images, but scripts of movement written directly onto the surface of the desert. Then the question, how were these geoglyphs used, receives an answer far stronger than a casual guess. They may have been used as sacred paths. Participants in ceremonies may have moved along them in ordered processions. Rituals connected with water, fertility, appeals to the gods, and fear of the harsh desert may have unfolded there. The lines became not decoration, but an instrument of belief. This is why the newer version appears so plausible. It explains not only the shape of the lines, but also their strange length, their non-intersecting structure, and their connection to a larger space. It removes the central paradox. The geoglyphs may have mattered not because they had to be seen in full, but because they had to be walked. For an ancient person, meaning may have been born not in viewing, but in movement. In this reading, the Nazca Desert no longer looks like a silent riddle for a tourist aircraft. It becomes a vast field of rituals, where the earth was marked not for beauty, but for action. And the main secret of the lines may be that they were not meant for a still gaze. They were meant for the step, for the procession, for the ceremony in which a human being entered the sign and became part of it. And now a detail appears in this story that cannot be brushed aside as a beautiful guess. Most Nazca figures are not arranged like ordinary drawings, where lines freely cross, overlap, and form a complex image. No, many of them are made from simple, clear, non-intersecting lines. And that changes everything, because such a line no longer looks only like a contour. It begins to look like a route that can be walked. A person could enter such a line at one point, move along it, and leave at the other end without stepping over a neighboring mark even once. For an artistic image, this is a strange feature. For a road, it is almost perfect. For a ritual path, even more so. What stands before us is not the chaotic fantasy of an ancient artist, but a disciplined scheme of movement drawn directly onto the surface of the desert. This refers to the key observation made by archaeologists. If a line can be walked without breaking its boundaries, then it may have been part of a ritual, not merely an image meant for a view from above. And this is where the comfortable version of Nazca as a collection of giant pictures begins to collapse. A picture is supposed to be seen. A road is supposed to lead. And if a geoglyph looks like a sign and works like a path at the same time, then ancient people may have given it a completely different meaning. They may not have looked at the figure from the outside. They may have entered it, moved along its contour, repeated a fixed route, and turned dry earth into sacred space. It must be understood how provocative this version really is. It pulls the Nazca Lines out of the familiar showcase of tourist mysteries and returns them to living religious practice. The question is no longer only who could see the drawings from above. The question is who walked along them, why they walked, and what order they followed. In an ancient ritual, the path itself is often no less important than the destination. If a person entered a line, he could become a participant in an action, not a spectator. His steps could repeat the shape of the sign. His movement could be part of an appeal to the forces of nature, to ancestors, to gods, to water, which was always scarce in the desert. In such a system, a line stops being a dead mark. It becomes an instruction. Where to go, how to go, where to begin, and where to end. This refers to the early history of the Nazca culture, when geoglyphs may have gradually changed their function, from visible signs on the ground into routes for ceremonial processions. That is why archaeologists speak of paths. Not random tracks, not everyday passages between settlements, but ceremonial routes. Such routes have order. People do not run along them at random. They move along them with intention, slowly, organized, and with inner meaning. And if there are thousands of such lines, if they occupy an enormous territory, then we are no longer dealing with a single ceremony, but with an entire system of sacred movement. The structure of the lines itself pushes toward this conclusion. Simplicity, lack of intersections, the possibility of walking from an entrance to an exit, all of this is too functional to be dismissed as coincidence. An ordinary drawing does not have to consider the human step. A ritual road does. It must be readable by the feet, not only by the eyes. It must set direction, restrict movement, and separate the path from the surrounding space. That is why the procession theory looks dangerously strong. It explains why the lines could be so large, why they stretched through the desert, and why they did not always need to be seen in full. For a participant in a ceremony, the general view from the sky is not the main point. The passage along the line is. He does not observe the sign, he passes through the sign. He does not look at the sacred form from outside. For a time, he becomes part of it. This refers to the major shift in understanding Nazca. The geoglyphs may have been not decoration of the ancient world, but an active mechanism of ritual. And then the desert stops being a mere background. It becomes a space of power, fear, and hope. The power of priests who may have controlled the order of ceremonies, fear of drought, hunger, and harsh nature, hope for rain, fertility, and the continuation of life. In such a world, the lines are not decoration and not entertainment. They are a hard instrument of belief, cut into the earth. That is why the question, why did they make them, can no longer be reduced to the banal answer, to draw. Perhaps they were not drawing in our sense at all. They were laying out sacred routes. They were creating roads that a person had to follow in a strictly defined order. They were turning the desert into a map of ritual where every line could be not just a form, but an action. And the more closely one looks at this version, the less Nazca resembles a mysterious album of an ancient artist. It looks much more like a grand system of ceremonial paths, where movement was the language, the earth was the text, and the human procession was the way to read that text to the end. Later, possibly because the population increased, the very logic of these lines began to change. If at first a geoglyph could have been a relatively short route for a narrow circle of participants, later the desert demanded a larger scale. More people meant more movement. More movement meant a longer path. And so an ancient line stopped being a modest sign on the ground and turned into an extended ceremonial track, designed not for one priest and not for a small group, but for a visible procession. Some trapezoids in the Nazca and Palpa region stretch to around 600 meters. 600 meters is not a random scratch, and not the whim of an ancient maker who had nothing better to do in the desert. It is a distance that must be walked. It is a space that requires time, order, and discipline. Such length already presses on the imagination by itself. A person enters the figure, walks along it, and the dry, marked ground still continues ahead. This refers to a period when rituals may have become more crowded, while the geoglyphs became longer and more organized. And here an uncomfortable pattern appears for simple explanations. If the lines were only drawings, why would they need to become longer as the number of people increased? A drawing does not have to grow longer when there are more viewers. But a road does. A route does. A ceremonial path must be able to handle the movement of those who pass along it. That is why the increasing length of the geoglyphs looks not like artistic evolution, but like a trace of a changing ritual. The larger the community, the more complex the ritual. The more participants, the stricter the order must be. People could not simply crowd into the desert and step chaotically across sacred lines. They needed a path that distributed movement, set direction, and turned a crowd into a procession. This is the hard logic of Nazca. The line did not merely depict a form, it controlled human bodies in space. If one imagines such a trapezoid, not from above, but from the ground, its meaning becomes rougher and clearer. It is not beautiful geometry for an airplane. It is an elongated corridor in the open desert. It has no walls, but it has boundaries. It has no roof, but it has the sky. It has no temple built of stone, but it has a path that must be followed until the earth itself becomes part of the ceremony. This refers to the version associated with the work of geophysicists Tomasz Gorka and Jörg Fassbinder. The ancient drawings may have served not as decoration, but as open-air sanctuaries. The names of the researchers matter here not as a decorative detail, but as support. Tomasz Gorka and Jörg Fassbinder did not merely repeat a beautiful legend about a mysterious desert. Their conclusions strengthened the idea that the Nazca Lines were connected with real human activity. If the space was used for rituals, then the increasing length of the paths looks natural. The ritual grew together with society, and the desert adjusted to the scale of the ceremony. This creates a harsher picture. We are not looking at ancient artists who stretched lines farther and farther across the sand for the sake of beauty. We are looking at a community in which ritual may have become more public, more crowded, and more demonstrative. The more people took part in the sacred action, the longer the route became. The longer the route, the stronger the power of the ritual over the individual. A 600-meter trapezoid is no longer a sign that can be quickly crossed by the eye. It is a distance that has to be overcome by the feet. In a hot desert, under an open sky, among dry ground, such a procession became a trial. Every step made the participant part of the shared action. Every meter emphasized that this was not a walk, not a road to a market, not an everyday passage between settlements. It was a path cut into the earth for ceremony. This refers to the main explanation for the lengthening of the geoglyphs. The lines may have grown because the need for mass ritual itself was growing. Then Nazca stops looking like a set of mysterious figures scattered across the desert without a clear reason. It begins to resemble a vast system of organized routes, where size was not a whim but a necessity. Ancient people may have enlarged trapezoids and lines not to impress future tourists, but to contain more participants, more movement, and more ceremonial tension. This explanation sounds far more convincing than talk about random decorative art. Length becomes evidence, scale becomes evidence, repetition becomes evidence. And if some geoglyphs really were extended as ritual activity grew, then the Nazca Desert was not simply a place where something was drawn. It was a place where society displayed its belief, its fear, its discipline, and its dependence on the forces of nature. That is why the question of line length is not a technical detail. It is a key to understanding the whole system. When a trapezoid stretches for hundreds of meters, it no longer asks to be called a picture. It demands another word: path, sanctuary, ceremonial ground. And it is here that the procession theory receives its heaviest argument. The geoglyphs became longer because more and more people likely had to walk along them. Now the version about ceremonial processions receives not just an elegant logic, but a cold physical clue. Scientists measured the magnetic field near a trapezoid close to Unama, a village near Palpa, and at other nearby drawings. Not legends, not guesses, not talk about builders from another world, but instruments showed that the ground in these places differs from the surrounding surface. Weak disturbances in the magnetic field indicated compacted soil. And this is where the most uncomfortable part begins for those who are used to seeing the Nazca Lines only as mysterious pictures. The ground was not merely marked, it was used. People walked on it, pressed it down with their feet, and changed it through repeated action. The desert preserved the trace not of one accidental passage, but of human activity strong enough to be detected by measurements centuries later. This refers to those sections of the geoglyphs where physical data showed that the surface may have been compacted precisely as a result of human movement. The very act of measuring the magnetic field matters here. In such research, scientists are not looking at the beautiful shape of the drawing or at a tourist photograph from the air. They are testing the ground itself. If one area remained untouched for centuries, it should differ from a place where people repeatedly passed. Paths, platforms, zones of ritual movement. All of these can leave a physical trace, even if the ancient participants vanished long ago and their voices were preserved in no chronicle. That is why the data near Unama becomes an important argument. If the soil is compacted where the lines run, then these lines may not have been merely visible contours. They may have functioned as roots. They were not only created, they were used. They were not only seen, people moved along them. And this changes the status of the entire mystery. We are not looking at dead geometry, but at the trace of repeated action. This refers to the main evidential turn. The procession theory rests not only on the shape of the geoglyphs, but also on the condition of the surface itself. Weak disturbances in the magnetic field sound dry, almost dull, but behind that dry phrase stands a harsh conclusion. Where a line is visible today, a person may have walked in ancient times, then another, then a third, then an entire group. If the ritual was repeated, the soil gradually became compacted, and that trace remained in the ground longer than the memory of the ceremony itself. There is no need here to invent fantastic machines. There is no need to search for traces of an ancient airfield. It is enough to accept a heavier version. The Nazca Desert was used as a vast sanctuary, and the geoglyphs were part of a living practice. People did not walk along these lines for leisure. They may have followed them in an established order, with a ritual purpose, obeying rules that now have to be reconstructed from tiny physical signs. This refers to the scientific value of geophysical measurements. They move the discussion of Nazca from the realm of attractive hypotheses into the realm of testable traces. It is especially important that compacted soil is not explained by the mere existence of a drawing. Drawing a line is one thing, walking along it repeatedly is another. If the surface changed under the impact of human activity, then the geoglyph was not only made, but also included in the life of the community. It was a place of action, not a decorative mark on a desert map. Such a conclusion strikes at the old habit of looking at Nazca only from above. From the air, the lines look like images, but the instruments pull attention back down, to the ground, to the feet, to the traces of movement. It is there, at the level of the surface, that the most stubborn argument is hidden. The meaning may not have been to see the figure in full, but to walk it correctly. This refers to the very core of the newer version. The geoglyphs may have been read not by the eyes, but by the steps. And if the ground truly preserved the trace of human movement, then the Nazca lines become far more serious than an ancient riddle for spectacular films. They turn into an archive without paper, without letters, and without stone inscriptions. An archive in which the text is compacted soil and the evidence is a quiet change in the magnetic field. That is why the geophysical data matters so much. It does not shout, decorate the legend, or promise sensation for the sake of sensation. It does something else. It shows that beneath the beautiful mystery, there may have been a strict ritual practice. The earth was affected by people. The lines were walked. The desert did not merely preserve drawings, it preserved the traces of those who once moved along them with a definite purpose. This is where the version of ceremonial roads gains a solid foundation. Not only the shape of the lines, not only their length, not only their non-intersecting structure, but the physics of the surface itself points in the same direction. The Nazca geoglyphs may have been a space of movement, ritual, and human presence. That means the desert was not a silent canvas, but a place where an ancient society left its heavy, literal mark on the earth. At the same time, Carsten Lambers, a participant in the Nazca-Palpa project, collected data on the location and exact dimensions of the lines. And here the desert once again stopped looking like a random collection of ancient signs. When the geoglyphs were mapped, when their size, direction, and position in relation to one another began to be studied together rather than separately, a much harder picture appeared. The lines may have worked not as isolated images, but as connected grounds for action, observation, and ritual order. Lamber's main conclusion sounds disturbingly simple. While some groups of people performed certain actions inside some geoglyphs, spectators on other geoglyphs could observe them. That means this may not have been a silent desert filled with beautiful figures, but an actual space of ceremony. Some walked along the lines, others stood on nearby sections and watched. Still others may have waited for their turn, held offerings, followed the signs, watched the priests, and obeyed the order of movement. This refers to an important change in the understanding of Nazca. The geoglyphs may have been not separate drawings, but part of a larger system in which participants and spectators occupied an organized space. Such a conclusion sharply changes the meaning of the entire plateau. If some geoglyphs could be seen from others, then the desert may have been arranged like a gigantic open-air stage. No stone amphitheaters, no columns, no walls. But there were lines, platforms, directions, and viewing points. In such a space, the ground itself became architecture, and a person standing on one geoglyph could watch an action taking place on another. This no longer looks like accidental ancient art. It looks like planning, like ritual staging, like a system in which it mattered not only to walk along a line, but also to be seen while doing it. A ceremony that is watched by others gains the force of public action. It becomes not a private prayer, but a display of belief, power, fear, and order inside society. If participants moved along some lines while observers stood on others, then Nazca was far more complex than drawings visible from the air. We may be looking at a space where movement and observation work together. The procession did not move into emptiness. It may have been watched. It may have been awaited. It may have been judged. And that turns the geoglyphs into an ancient mechanism of collective ritual. This refers to the idea that the location and dimensions of the lines mattered not only for the shape of the drawings, but also for organizing people in space. The dry, almost bureaucratic phrase, "location and exact dimensions of the lines," is especially important here. In an ordinary text, it may pass unnoticed, but it contains the main threat to older explanations. If dimensions and positions coincide with the possibility of observation, then we are not dealing with chaos and not with simple decoration. We are dealing with a space arranged so that action could be seen from specific points. In this sense, Nazca begins to resemble not a picture gallery, but a place of mass ritual. Participants entered the lines, moved along them, and may have performed prescribed actions. Spectators on other geoglyphs became part of the same event. They did not merely watch. Their presence confirmed the importance of the ceremony. In an ancient society, a spectator is not passive audience. A spectator is a witness, and a witness turns a ritual into a public fact. In this reading, the desert takes on an almost hard political function. Whoever controlled the route controlled the ritual. Whoever determined where participants had to move and where spectators had to stand controlled order. And order in sacred space is already power. Ancient societies often tied religion, fear of nature, and social discipline into one tight knot. This refers to the possible role of the geoglyphs as a space where society not only prayed, but also displayed hierarchy, organization, and submission to a shared ritual. That is why Lamber's idea matters so much. It adds another layer to the Nazca Lines. They were not only paths that people walked, They may also have been grounds between which visual contact was possible. And where there is action and observation, a stage appears. Where there is a stage, order appears. Where there is order, someone exists who sets that order. This must be imagined without romantic fog, not mysterious ancient artists leaving beautiful traces in the sand. Possibly an entire society took part in complex ceremonies where every group knew its place. Some walked the route, others watched. Someone carried offerings, someone directed the ritual. And all of this happened not inside a roofed temple, but in the open desert, where the horizon, sun, and ground themselves became part of the action. This explanation makes the Nazca Lines even more uncomfortable. They no longer fit the image of a simple riddle for a tourist airplane. They look like a carefully organized ritual space, where every line could guide movement, every ground could gather people, and every neighboring geoglyph could serve as a point of observation. This refers to the main expansion of the theory. The geoglyphs may have been not isolated objects, but connected elements of a vast ceremonial system. And if this is true, then the spectators of the Nazca period were not random people standing nearby. They may have been part of the ritual just as much as those who walked along the lines. Their gaze was included in the action. Their presence turned processions into an event for the whole community. And the desert itself became not emptiness, but a vast public space where belief showed itself through movement, order, and scale. That is why data on the location and dimensions of the lines matters so much. It suggests that Nazca may have been built not only for a view from above, but also for a view from a neighboring line. Not only for gods, but also for people. Not only for mystery, but for a strictly organized ritual in which some moved, others watched, and the entire desert worked as a single stage under the merciless Peruvian sky. In addition, platforms were discovered near the geoglyphs, mounds made of stone, and this detail finally knocks the ground out from under the version that these were just drawings. Beside the lines were not random piles of rock, not natural uneven patches, and not the rubbish of an ancient desert. They looked like deliberately created places where a person was supposed to stop, perform an action, and leave an offering. If the lines were roads of ritual, then the platforms may have been their key points. The route did not lead into emptiness. It may have led to a place of offering, to a stone mound, to an altar under the open sky. And then the Nazca Desert begins to look even harder. We are dealing not only with paths for processions, but also with places where those processions may have reached their main purpose. This refers to the archaeological finds near the geoglyphs. The platforms strengthen the version that the lines were part of a religious system, not decorative drawings on the ground. Archaeologists excavated one of these mounds, and what they found inside does not fit well with an everyday explanation. They discovered many broken potsherds, shells, remains of plant food, and other objects that look like ritual offerings. This does not look like an ordinary dump. It does not look like a random collection of things left by travelers. It looks like the trace of an action that was repeated according to rules. Broken potsherds may seem like a small detail by themselves, but in archaeology, a small detail is often more dangerous than a loud sensation. A vessel may have been broken intentionally. Food may have been left not because it had spoiled, but because it was brought as a gift. Shells may have reached the place not by accident, but as signs understood by people of that culture. In this context, a stone platform stops being a pile of rocks and becomes a place of contact between human beings and the forces on which life depended. This refers to the ritual meaning of the objects found there. Potsherds, food, shells, and other offerings suggest that sacred actions, not everyday activity, may have taken place beside the lines. This is where the version of ceremonial roads receives new support. If a person simply walked along a line, that is already important. But if at the end of that line, or near it, there was a place for offerings, then the entire route gains meaning. A procession could begin at one section, move along a strictly defined path, and end at a platform where offerings were left. In this way, line, movement, and altar joined into a single system. Such an arrangement does not require the stone walls of a temple. The desert itself became the temple. The ground was the floor. The lines were the boundaries. The altar was the stone mound. The sky was the roof, and the sun was the merciless witness of the rite. In such a harsh space, every offering gained special weight because the issue was not beauty, but survival. If there is no water in the desert, if the harvest depends on rare rains, if a community lives on the edge of risk, then ritual stops being an ornament of life. It becomes a weapon against fear. People bring offerings not because they have too much, but because they are anxious. They leave food, shells, vessels, because they want to receive in return what matters most: water, fertility, and the continuation of life. This refers to the logic of the ancient rite itself. An offering was not a random gesture, but an attempt to negotiate with a world that could be hostile and unpredictable. The platforms near the geoglyphs give this story material weight. Without them, one could argue endlessly, are the lines roads or drawings, routes or images, signs for gods, or a riddle for future aircraft? But stone mounds and the finds inside them move the discussion in a more concrete direction. Where there is an altar, there is action. Where there are offerings, there is a request. Where there is a request, there are fear and belief. That is why these platforms matter so much. They show that the geoglyphs may not have been lonely lines marking the desert for some obscure beauty. They may have been part of a space where people came, walked a prescribed route, gathered near stone mounds, and left what they considered valuable. This is no longer abstract geometry. This is the trace of living religious practice. In this form, Nazca becomes far darker and stronger. It is not an open-air museum and not a mysterious picture for an aeroplane. It is a desert sanctuary, where the ground was marked for movement, platforms served as points of ritual, and the objects found there spoke of offerings. And the more such details appear, the harder it becomes to call the lines simple ancient art. This refers to the main archaeological argument. Near the geoglyphs, there were places that may have functioned as altars, and inside them, traces of ritual offerings were preserved. A stone platform looks rough on the outside, but its meaning may have been enormous. Processions may have ended there. Participants in the rite may have stood beside it. Food, vessels, shells, and other objects may have been placed on it, turning simple stone into the center of a ceremony. In a desert where every resource had value, such a gift was not an empty symbol. It was payment, request, and sacrifice without unnecessary words. And if everything is connected, non-intersecting lines, the possibility of movement, extended trapezoids, traces of compacted soil, points of observation, and stone platforms, the picture becomes too dense to dismiss as coincidence. Nazca begins to speak in the language of ritual. The line leads. The procession moves. Spectators watch. Offerings remain at the altar, and the desert preserves all of it for centuries, like a vast archive written not with letters, but with stone, sand, and human fear before the forces of nature. But the most interesting find turned out to be pieces of a marine shell of the genus Spondylus. And at this point, the mystery of the Nazca Lines stops being merely a discussion about strange figures in the desert. A single object appears that connects land, water, climate, belief, and the fear of an ancient society into one chain. A shell found near the geoglyphs may sound like a small detail, but details like this often destroy the most comfortable explanations. Spondylus was not an ordinary shell that could be picked up beside a line and accidentally left on a stone platform. It came from the coastal waters of northern Peru. In the south, such a find carried special meaning because its appearance was associated with the climatic phenomenon known as El Niño. And El Niño brought what dry land needed more than gold, power, or beautiful legends: heavy rains. This refers to the most sensitive point in the whole Nazca story, a desert where water decided the fate of people preserved, beside its sacred lines, a symbol of water and fertility. This is where the ritual version receives its strongest meaning. If Spondylus shells are found on platforms near the geoglyphs, then these were probably not decorative gifts and not random objects. These shells may have been signs of request. People brought them to the places where processions moved, where stone mounds stood, where the ground was marked with lines, and they appealed to the forces on which rain depended. The desert does not forgive beautiful mistakes. There, water is not poetry and not an abstract symbol. It is harvest, food, children, settlements, and the very possibility of continuing life. When rain does not come, everything begins to collapse. Fields dry up, stores disappear, and the community waits for disaster. That is why a shell connected with rain could become an object of enormous religious force. It was not brought for decoration, it was brought as a sign of hope. This refers to the ancient understanding of Spondylus as a symbol of water and fertility, especially important in the dry regions of southern Peru. And now it becomes clear why the geoglyphs may not have been simply images. If the lines were paths, the platforms were altars, and Spondylus was a symbol of rain, then the whole system forms a hard and almost unavoidable logic. People did not walk along the lines for leisure. They may have walked for ritual. The ritual may have been connected with a request for water, and water in the desert was a matter of survival. In this picture, every detail begins to work. Non-intersecting lines set the route. Extended trapezoids allowed more people to participate. Compacted soil showed the trace of movement. Neighboring geoglyphs may have served as places of observation. Stone platforms received offerings, and Spondylus shells gave the key to what ancient participants in these ceremonies may have been asking for. That is why the discovery of the shells matters so much. It moves Nazca from the area of a vague mystery into the area of harsh human necessity. There is no longer any need to build beautiful theories about drawings for the sky or fantasize about strange landing strips. It is enough to look at the desert and understand. The people who lived there depended on water so strongly that they could turn entire stretches of land into sacred routes. This refers to the final chain of the whole version: desert, lack of water, El Niño, Spondylus, fertility, ritual. A shell from a distant coast on a platform near a geoglyph is not a random detail. It is a sign of exchange, travel, belief, and tense expectation of rain. It had to be obtained, carried, preserved, brought to the right place, and left there as part of a rite. Such an object does not appear in ceremonial space without a reason. It works like a key that opens the meaning of the whole system. And the more closely one looks at this find, the harsher the conclusion becomes. The Nazca Lines may not have been a mysterious message to an unknown viewer, but part of a religious practice connected with the simplest and most merciless question: will there be water? Will there be harvest? Will the community survive the next season? In such a world, a geoglyph is not a picture. It is an action. It is a request drawn into the earth. Spondylus connects Nazca not with fantasy, but with the reality of ancient life, with the sea from which a rare symbol came, with the climate which could bring rain, with the platforms where offerings were left, with the lines along which people walked, with the desert where every ritual was an attempt to hold balance between fear and hope. This refers to the main meaning of the entire explanation. The Nazca Lines may have been a vast system of appeal to the forces of water, fertility, and the continuation of life. And then the final image becomes stronger than any sensation. In the dry Peruvian desert, people drew lines, built platforms, walked routes, brought shells connected with rain, and left them where the ground had already been turned into a sanctuary. They were not merely decorating sand, they were trying to speak to a world that could give them water or take away their future. That is why Spondylus becomes the main key to the mystery. This shell shows what the processions may have moved for, why altars may have been needed, and why the entire system of geoglyphs may have had religious meaning. The Nazca Lines were perhaps not drawings for an idle view from above. They were roads of request, roads of fear, roads of hope, enormous traces of an ancient people who, in the driest land, searched for an answer from water. And if the Nazca Lines were truly not just drawings, but roads of request, fear, and hope, then we are not looking at a dead mystery of the past. We are looking at the trace of a people who, in dry earth, tried to find an answer from the sky, from water, and from the gods. Now write in the comments, what do you think? Were the Nazca Lines an ancient sanctuary, a map of rituals, or the trace of something even stranger that no one still wants to explain to us? If you found this episode interesting, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new investigations from the archive of uncomfortable facts. And make sure to click the bell, because ahead are stories after which the familiar picture of the past will no longer look so calm.